Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Regional Housing Nexus webinar, one of the many interactive technical assistance events being offered through the PlanIt Education and Training Program to planners, consultants, elected officials, and technical staff as local governments prepare to begin comprehensive plan updates. My name is Salma Safula, an associate planner and local planning assistant at the Metropolitan Council, and I will be your moderator today. If you are an AICP member, this event is eligible for 1 CM credit, which you must attend the entire event in order to receive. Credits for participation can be claimed by going to your CM log on the APA website. Before we start, let's go over some housekeeping that will be pasted into the chat. Today's webinar is being recorded. Feel free to turn on live captions with Teams. We will be sharing a link to the webinar with you after the event. We welcome you to revisit the contents yourself and share it with colleagues. Feel free to enter questions in the chat throughout today's presentation, and our speaker will be happy to answer. We will also have dedicated time at the end of the presentation for some more questions and discussion. Today's event will be led by housing and planning professionals Maya Guerrero-Combs, Spencer Cox-Farhat, Nels Nelson, and Jeff Saucer. Maya Guerrero-Combs is a planning analyst with the Met Council's Housing and Livable Communities Act team. Spencer Cox-Farhat is a senior planner with Met Council's Housing and Livable Communities Act team. Spencer specializes in technical assistance and housing policy with a focus on implementing the Housing Forward Cities initiative. Nels Nelson is a principal at Community Scale, an urban planning consultancy and technical lead for the Nexus study. His work includes comprehensive rezoning, housing suitability assessments, and strategy for clients including local governments and regional planning agencies. Jeff Saucer is a principal at Community Scale, an urban planning consultancy, and project manager for the Nexus study. Jeff has led urban planning projects for public and private sector clients in urban, suburban, and rural contexts across the city. I will now turn it over to our experts. Thank you.
Great. Hi, my name is Nels Nelson, and I will be sharing the presentation with you. All right, that should be popped up now. So we've had a great privilege of working with Met Council on this exciting project, and are excited to share the results with you. So this is the result of the inclusionary zoning and housing nexus study. Let's see if this will go to the next slide.
We'll be okay.
Okay. Oh, why did it go to the end? Okay. Okay, so what is inclusionary housing ordinance? It requires developers to set aside a share of new units at below market rate rents. And this is funded by an internal subsidy from the market rate units into income restricted units. So a typical IHO that you might see is 10% of units in developments that have 10 or more units should be affordable to households earning less than 60% of the area median income, which is defined by HUD. And this aligns with how Met Council is defining affordability as well. So what's special about an IHO is that it's an internal subsidy. So it doesn't require public dollars, but it does require a strong enough market such that the market rate units can generate enough revenue to pay for the construction and also generate enough revenue in order to carry the affordable units. So we're going to dive into why that's important for the Met Council region. So another thing to consider is that because IHOs are a form of fee on private development, they need to establish a rational nexus between that fee that's being applied and the impact of the new market rate unit and this is called the Nexus. So the rational nexus, and that's why we did a Nexus study. And this is becoming more important after a Supreme Court decision in 2024 that requires this rational connection between the project that's being proposed and its impacts. And so I just also shared a screen grab of a news article where this is being challenged. And so we wanted to provide materials that would help communities to think about establishing that rational nexus. So the study is a two-part test. The first part, like we talked about, is that nexus. So finding what would be the legal limit in terms of how much impact that new market rate unit is creating in terms of the demand for affordable housing. And the second is what would be the economic feasibility. So how much surplus profit is being generated per market rate unit in order to support the below market rate units. And then in our calculator, we take the lesser of the two, and that's the result of the two-part test. So we're going to start with the nexus. So we're going to talk about how we model the input and output of new housing, and then creating a demand for affordable housing. This is the, let's say, standard model, which starts with a new market rate housing unit or a new project with several units. Those new residents have a certain income that's required in order to rent those new market rate units. Then they go out in their communities and spend money on goods and services. Some of that money, the gross receipts to wages, goes into new jobs. So we have job creation based upon the new market rate housing. And then those workers form households. So we have local worker households. Not all those households being created to fill those jobs are able to pay for market rate housing. And so therefore we have the affordable housing need. So this is the process that we kind of walk through, and then we can determine for each new market rate housing unit what the affordable housing generation is on the other side of it. This model is extremely sensitive to how we think about market rate rents for several reasons. A new unit's rent not only determines what that household's income has to be in order to afford that rent, but then also that household's income filters through in terms of how much spending they have in the local economy. And it also helps to prove the carrying capacity for the subsidized unit. So the exact number that we pick for the market rate rent is really important. And it is also challenging because even looking at current rents in CoStar, which is the data platform the Met Council uses, means looking at rents for projects that have been built in the past, but aren't necessarily representative of the expected rents that developers might be asking for projects that they're just beginning to permit now. So we can come back to that later, and we have some ways of overriding that, but just wanted to set it out that this is a very fundamental input to the calculator, is how much rent you're expecting. So now we have a household that is able to afford market rate rents. We can think about if they're spending 30% of their income on market rate rent, then the other 70%, or we can back into what that total number is. And then we have spending across these different categories. This is from the Consumer Expenditure Survey. So vehicle purchases, food at home, food away from home, entertainment, etc. It's all broken down by a federal survey. And then we can look at the industry jobs that are actually supporting that spending. So this graph continues to break down those higher level numbers into actual jobs. And then from the Minneapolis state figures, we know what the typical wages are in those jobs. So, for example, a lot of the food at home or dining out jobs, where a lot of that money is going, are lower paying jobs. And so the households that are working in those industries typically might not be able to afford market rate housing. So this kind of radial chart breaks down that spending into wages. So there's another calculation that we have to do, which is that those are just individual incomes. Those individuals form households at a certain rate. So you can have two earner households, multiple earner households. What we found, though, is that especially in the lower income brackets, you typically have workers in single earner households. So these are smaller households. So that extremely low income category has 80% single earner households, and then 20% are in multi-earner households. And then you can kind of scale it from there. And so with that, we were able to more accurately say spending in this category is creating households of this income, and not necessarily just taking all the incomes and multiplying them by 2 with the assumption that everyone's in a 2-earner household, because it's not necessarily the case. In fact, there's a lot of single earner households. So finally, once we've been able to go all the way from a new market rate housing unit all the way over across to the affordable housing need, based upon that consumer spend, we're able to identify that, at least in this case, the total housing need per 100 market rate units is 14 units. And then that's broken down further by the different income categories: extremely low income, very low income, the 60% AMI, and low income. And then one of the things that the calculator does is it helps you pin what the expected AMI or income level is going to be for the market rate unit as well, because a lot of the market rate units in the region fall somewhere within these categories as well. And so we don't want to have a model that's showing that a household income that's, let's say, between 80 and 100% is subsidizing, something higher than that. So anyway, this is the end result of the Nexus calculator, and it's useful. It spits out not only a number of units, but then also the final step is taking that number of units, looking at the difference between the market value of a market rate unit and the market value of an income restricted unit, and then determining what the present value of that is, and then assigning that on a per unit basis to the market rate units as the maximum Nexus fee. That leads pretty easily into our next discussion, which is about the financial feasibility. So this is the second of the 2-part tests. And there's some useful kind of like terminology that we use that I just wanted to level set on that before diving in. The first one is net operating income. So this is all of the rents minus operating expenses and other types of losses. So you can just think about this as the total income that a project receives on an annual basis. Then the second one is total development cost. So that's your construction costs and financing costs. You'll see that pop up a couple times. And also very helpfully, we have kind of baseline numbers on a per unit basis from Minnesota Housing. The next one is yield on cost. So that's your NOI divided by total development cost, TDC. And this is what we use to determine whether a project is financially feasible. So in this market, that's typically the assumption is that the yield on cost should be at least 6.25%. And if it's less than that, then the project won't be built. And so that's a good number to keep in mind as we start playing with the rents and how much affordable housing is going to be required, is that if you overload that and you start getting lower numbers than 6.25, then the project might not be worth investing in. And then the cap rate is the NOI divided by the current market value. And that is a useful number for thinking about what the current value is of the difference in rents between the market rate unit and the affordable unit, so we can assign what that value is in the Nexus fee. Okay. So as I mentioned, 6.25 is what we're using as the minimum threshold to attract capital. This is something that could be adjusted in the calculator. Another thing that you can do in the calculator is look at different scenarios for inclusionary housing. So what percentage of units at what percentage of AMI, and then see in your particular case how that impacts the yield on cost. So just to give a couple examples, and I think this will lead into how we think about the calculator and how we show things, is that in order to afford construction costs as established by Minnesota Housing in their per unit construction cost, total development cost, let's say prediction for the coming year that they use for planning projects, the break-even market rate rent is about $2,600 or $3.33 a square foot. And then if you want to add on top of that inclusionary housing for 10% of units at 50% of AMI, just as an example, that makes it such that the market rate units are going to have a premium closer to $4 per square foot. And these are high rents, but projects are getting built with high rent in the region. I included a couple of examples down below there. So you could expect that an IHO would work in areas that are having by right multifamily development that are also in neighborhoods that are attracting some of the higher rents in the region. Okay, so with that all being said, we're going to take a quick look at the actual calculator in this webinar. So I'm going to switch tabs over to this one. So for a lot of you, this will be your first time seeing it, so I can kind of do a quick kind of run through about what it does and how it works and what the tabs are. So the first thing is that you can select your community here. These are all pre-inputted or pre-baked in, and it will tell you some things like what your CoStar rents are, whether you're suburban or urban for Minnesota Housing. And then these yellow fields are editable, so you can change some of the values in here. And then the gray fields are the output fields. And we even have a handy little chart here that will kind of show you in real time what the output of the Nexus calculator is. If we scroll down a little bit, we have a kind of a high-level walkthrough of the Nexus calculator itself. And then if we go through the tabs, this next tab is the financial feasibility, also known as a pro forma in some circles. And this allows you to set the parameters for a project in your community. So you can change a lot of things like the number of units, square footage. You can adjust that yield on cost like I talked about. You can really get in the weeds here. And this is also where you can test different IHO amounts, and then it shows.
Did we
Steps.
lose Nels?
Oh, no. I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Flaky Wi-Fi, I guess, here. So I was just walking through the financial feasibility. Did you get me to this point? Yeah, okay. I got a thumbs up from Spencer. Okay, so these tabs calculate the Nexus, basically. And so this is looking at the employment generation through a number of steps, and then looking at that Nexus fee based upon the different income categories, the workers in different size households, and then also creating a value for that subsidy to be required to cover the lost revenue of the unit from the below market rate. And then the rest of these tabs are a lot of numbers that are feeding into the Nexus study. Okay, so that's a very high-level picture of what this thing does. Now let's take a look at how this calculator works in a specific location. So I picked to start with Arden Hills here. So this is a suburban community. It has high rents, high enough to support construction. So there's a couple things going on here. The first is the nexus of induced demand, which is at almost $90,000 per unit. And that's based upon the spending of the people in those market rate units in the local economy. And then we have the rental value that's being generated by the rents in this scenario, which is 200 units. The total development cost. And so this currently is picking from the Minnesota housing number, but we can also instead pick a pro forma number, or you can even have an override option where you can put in a custom value of how much, what the construction cost is on a per unit basis, or we're going to stick with Minnesota housing for now. And then it tells you what the economically feasible fee would be in this circumstance, and then takes the lesser of that and the nexus and gives you a number here that is the output of this calculator. So this is showing one example where you have a high rent market. If I skip down to Brooklyn Center, you can see the story is a little bit different, where CoStar is reporting market rents that are closer to $1,500 or about $2 per square foot. And as we looked at earlier, you need closer to $3.33 to pay for the new market rate construction as defined by Minnesota housing. So with this model, there's a negative number in terms of the economically feasible fee. So right now, according to this model, the market rate rents are not supporting new market rate construction, and therefore also would not support inclusionary housing, which would essentially add costs on top of that. We do have a positive number for the nexus of induced demand, because those people are still spending in the economy. But with a negative economically feasible fee, the total maximum as an output of this is zero. So there's a number of ways to adjust if you're in a circumstance like this. You could talk with developers about what types of rents they might be expecting for new construction, which might be different than what CoStar is reporting. And then you can select an override option. For example, if you thought that there was going to be $3,000 a month units, you can also make adjustments to the pro forma and also have it just a general override option on the total development cost. So that is the high level overview of the calculator, and I will jump back over to what the policy implications are of this. So as you might have gathered from me talking about it, IHO is a strong market mechanism. So it really works in areas where you have by right multifamily, and those rents are high enough to support construction, and you think there might be additional value on the table that can be used to cross-subsidize affordable housing. If you're in a circumstance where multifamily housing is already at the negotiating table with the community, for example, needing a special permit, tax abatement, different types of relief, then a blanket inclusionary housing ordinance isn't necessary because you're already playing open book with the project applicant and negotiating an affordable housing rate. So again, just think about IHO as this is something that we want for by right construction. With that, you should tailor the requirements to your market. So there's a lot of ways that you can use the calculator to find what would be suitable for a minimum unit count. Like I said at the start, 10 units is typical, but it could be more, it could be less. How much is being set aside, what the affordability depth is, or if there's a number of options. For example, you could have fewer units at higher affordability or more units at an affordability that's a bigger number. Also, one of the things that is popular is to have a fee in lieu that would go to an affordable housing trust as a kind of a buyout option that can help build affordable housing in your community. It is also reported by developers to be easier to administer. And then we can also test other inputs like what your land cost is, et cetera. So yeah, you can use this to help tailor your IHO. And finally, to help shift the economics, you can do things like have bonuses for IHO that make it more economically feasible. Additional height, expedited review, reduced parking. These are all examples of giving some kind of relief to an IHO project. And it's quite a common mechanism for communities in the Met region right now. So with all that, I think we're going to wrap up and I can hand it over to Maya.
Thanks, Nels.
No. Go ahead, Spencer.
Hey, Jake, we'll do, I know you like the Arden Hills reference. We'll do questions here at the end so we can pull them all together. But we're going to translate over now to speaking about the Met Council region. But first, I wanted to thank Jeff and Nels and Community Scale for their excellent work on this project. They developed a tool that I think is really functional and easy to use, as well as containing a huge amount of information in a way that's nice. I also wanted to thank everyone here today and also to thank people that helped participate along the process of developing this study and our engagement sessions. It was really helpful to hear some feedback. But I want to hand it over to Maya now, who's going to be talking about some of the regional implications of the Housing Nexus study, how to use it, how cities have been using it historically, and how we can use the tool to develop good inclusionary housing ordinances here in the Twin Cities. Take it away,
Great,
Maya.
thanks, Spencer. So my name is Maya Godot Combs. I'm a planning analyst with the Met Council. And apologies, my voice is a little rough from catching the cold that's been going around. But today we're just going to root kind of what Jeff and Nels presented on in some context for the Twin Cities region. So, how is this calculator helpful for local governments? There's obviously some very specific, clear uses for this calculator for local governments to calculate a maximum allowable in lieu fee or reasonable in lieu fee rooted and informed in financial feasibility information. Local governments can use this to update existing inclusionary housing requirements to play with project minimums, project unit minimums, affordability percentages, and things like that. But beyond inclusionary requirements, what we really heard is that this is a really great communication tool. So beyond in lieu of fees, this tool is really great for communicating either the importance of affordable housing in your community. So looking at when you build market rate housing, what is the demand that's inducing in some of these lower wage jobs? And on the flip side, what we heard from local staff and developers alike is this is a really great communication tool to show how financially feasible it is to build affordable housing and the costs associating with building deeper affordable housing, which we all know is a deep need in this community. So this tool is really helpful both for local governments who are thinking about adopting inclusionary housing requirements, those that already have inclusionary housing requirements, and those who are just looking for a communication tool about affordable housing in their community and how to communicate around that. So now I want to ground the policy recommendations from Nels and Jeff to the region. So according to our annual housing survey, there are currently 13 cities in the region that have some kind of mixed income policy or inclusionary housing ordinance in place. The first adopted policy we see reported was in 2014. And recently, in the last 5 years, we've seen 4 cities who have adopted inclusionary housing policy or ordinance or some kind of zoning requirement. So, as we know, development varies year to year, but when comparing all multifamily development in the region to multifamily development in all areas with inclusionary requirements over the last 15 years, so from 2010 to 2025, using our building permit data, we've seen that multifamily production has followed regional trends in those areas that are implementing inclusionary zoning. But in the last 2 years, we have seen multifamily slow more than the regional average in these areas with inclusionary requirements. So it is really important to use this calculator to check your assumptions and your requirements to make sure that they're still working in the markets that are being pretty variable right now. So, but it's working, right? So especially post the with the production boom we had post 2019, these requirements worked and built affordable housing units. Looking at the Minneapolis inclusionary zoning tracking dashboard, we saw that 278 affordable housing units have been permitted on site, so in the building. And there have also been recent wins across the region, including Golden Valley and beyond. So looking at the actual requirements that have been put in place in the region, so what we're seeing cities implement here, we generally see project unit minimums that range from 5 to 20 units. So that's a pretty big range. And the requirements apply both to rental and ownership properties. So we are seeing both applications in our region. Generally, inclusionary requirements here in the region are tied to incentives or exemptions, compliant amendments, and more. So rather than mandating that every development falls under the inclusionary requirements, cities have limited inclusionary requirements to those asking for zoning changes from the city or other incentives. Cities in the region also have different inclusionary requirements based on the tier of affordability. So smaller requirements for deeper affordability. A common example is 15% at 60% AMI, 10% at 50% AMI, and 5% at 30% AMI. But we see variance across inclusionary requirements in the city. And then a lot of requirements in the inclusionary requirements in the region also have alternatives to providing units on site, such as dedication or in lieu fees. So What does that mean? So what are some best practices? A large part of the feedback we got from developers was predictability. And so making sure that a city has the requirements established and clear so developers know what the requirements are, what the alternatives are, such as an in lieu fee, before going into the process, and that those requirements stay consistent. Additionally, what we're seeing right now is that you don't want your requirements to aim for the strongest market, right? You want them to be able to weather and be more feasible in order to build more units. And so building in a maintenance structure is really important, and using this calculator tool to check how requirements are working every few years is a really great practice. And for reference, I will talk later in a couple slides about where to find this, or the next slide actually, about where to find this calculator. And we do plan on updating the data in this calculator on a like every 2 years probably. So this is something that local governments can come back to over time. Moving on to moving through the best practices. So project size minimums. We know that larger projects have more flexibility in their finance structures to meet inclusionary requirements. If you're trying to target deeper affordability, we know that deeper affordability is the greatest need in our region. We're generally seeing developers choose the higher AMIs, right? Like that's just more financially feasible for them. Even though those 60% AMI thresholds come with higher inclusionary requirement percentages. So if your aim is to target deeper affordability, recognize that those units take deeper financial commitments to support over time and either require less units or more incentives for those deeper affordability units. We also, incentives is a great practice. The calculator demonstrates the cost it takes to support affordable housing units. So layering inclusionary requirements with incentives for developers who are building units on site, especially in not as strong or robust as a market, such as reduced parking minimums, density bonuses, code flexibility, impact fee reductions, and more. So always a really best practice in order to make sure those affordable units get built on site. And while we know the best practice is building units on site, developers told us that in lieu fees are an easy to understand alternative if you do have an alternative in your requirement, as long as they know how much those fees will be. So make sure you're being transparent about what those fees are, and then also make sure you have a plan for how those funds will be used. So just a short and sweet wrap up of kind of what we heard today. You're probably really excited to hear where is the calculator. So we have published a web page that goes over this Nexus study and the process, as well as the report generated by Community Scale, Nels and Jeff here. I added a link here. You go to our regular metrocouncil.org site, go to the housing section, and then the projects policy work, you'll find mixed income housing. If you select that, you'll find the web page. At the bottom of the web page, there will be a link. Our communications will be posting it today. So when we send out materials from this webinar, it will have a link to the calculator that you can download that spreadsheet that Nels went over today and play with it yourself. So that is coming today. This is where you're going to be able to find it on the website. And with that, I'm going to wrap us up.
Well, thank you all for joining today's webinar. We will send a follow-up email next week with a link to this recording and other relevant resources like the one we shared in the chat. There will be more PlanIt events coming up here in 2026. You can find a schedule of upcoming events in the link I will send in just a minute. And it would be greatly appreciated if you could also complete the short survey we will send. Your feedback will help improve PlanIt events in the future. Thank you again, and thank you to our speakers for such a wonderful and informative presentation. We hope you all have a great rest of your day.